Okay, so just to start off, I want to begin by acknowledging that this book is really fraught with some dominant colonial narratives of gender. And it continues to, in some ways, perpetuate a cisgender, heterosexual, white male voice in research. And I think that this is very visible in chapter 5. It's not something that I want to go unquestioned as we're reading it together. However, I want to stay with this text because the value of it is in how it speaks to the lived experience. And it does this really well in terms of thinking of some of the methodological dispositions that enable us to write of the lived experience into being with children and with a pedagogic sense. So um, I'm aware that there are some tensions that might be arising as you're encountering this book. And again, as we're thinking through research, we're always non-neutral. Our perspectives are always coming from somewhere and from a history. So in encountering this book, in some ways, we're encountering some of those multiple histories of research that we need to be aware of as well. Um, so let's see if I can change my. I'm going to stop sharing for a sec. Sorry, just 1 minute. I'm having a technical issue with my PowerPoint. Okay, I might actually just show you it like this because I'm not sure why it won't let me. Oh, there we go. Okay. So in thinking about that, Elliot Eisner writes that the medium we choose to use and the particular form of representation we select, say sound rather than visual form, affect our perception of the world. So if we're to represent something through a medium, we try and define the qualities of experience or features of the world that will lend themselves to the medium that we have selected. Thus, representation influences not only what we intend to express, but what we're able to see in the first place. And this is something that Van Manen is trying to make visible for us in phenomenological research, is that our methods are not neutral. Our methods create realities. So rather, if we're looking through a lens, if we're looking through photography, or if we're looking through videography or through writing processes, our methods that we choose render particular things visible over others. And so when we're thinking about writing, we're really writing worlds and writing meaning into being as we use our methods. So Van Manen tells us that language is the only way by which we can bring the pedagogic experience into a symbolic form that creates, by its very discursive nature, a conversational relation. So writing in this way is bodied. It's a movement in and beyond the subjective self that's seeking to get closer to meaning. So it's a recollecting, a revisiting, and a consistent retelling that continues to search and get closer to the meaning proposed in the pedagogic relation. So this space between the human and the world, that's the response that we're generating as educators, and it's situated in that in-between space. And that is really where writing is located, because it's where something leaves your body, it leaves yourself, it encounters the world, and then something comes into being. So phenomenological writing in this sense is not an add-on or an explanatory tool to sum up what happened in research, but rather the phenomenological writing is an act of research itself, where the existence of something is co-composed via living experience and the language used to interpret and relive it. So where we write ourselves and the worlds into being. And as we've discussed before, language here is much more than only communicative. Language creates the worlds, writing creates worlds. Yet with this said, it's important to highlight again the partiality of this writing, that it's not only humans compose worlds, but rather we're gathering meaning from our relations with the worlds in which we live through interpretation and writing. And as we write, those compositions are altered. So it's always in part and partial. And Van Manen speaks also about the corporeality of writing. It's a bodily response to something happening in the world where our bodies are responding, and in doing so, something changes. There's an ontological nature of the work. And by ontology, I mean the study of how things exist, the study of being. Therefore, writing is not only epistemological or of thought and knowledge, that's the study of epistemology, is about how we think about our thinking, but it's ontological in that the ways in which the world exists and is lived is becoming here. So we're situating our writing in the ontological, not only the epistemological that stays in the thinking process. It's in the lived, bodied, grounded experience of how it is in the world. So revisiting again, page 13 of our Van Manen text, it says, for phenomenology, as in poetry, it's inappropriate to ask for a conclusion or a summary of the study. To summarize a poem in order to present the result would destroy the result itself, because the poem is the result. The poem is the thing. And so here, pedagogical narrations and our inquiry projects and writing, that is the thing. They are the marks and the making of curriculum. So your writing here is the thing. It is an of the lived inquiry, not before, not after, and not separate. It is in the method, and it is in some ways the product of research, along with the pedagogical effects that it produces. So in chapter 5, Van Manen speaks about storying to compel, to lead us to reflect, to involve us personally, to transform, and to measure one's interpretive sense. He writes that the purpose and power of the anecdote, particularly in inquiry writing, as a methodological device to make comprehensible some notion that might easily elude us, something that might escape us, but in writing the anecdote, we make it more visible. So it speaks of a narrative of a moment or some event as being in itself interesting or striking. There's something compelling about this moment that's worth writing about. So stories tell us something that quantitative or factual writing really cannot do. Stories tell us something beyond the literal. They provoke us to something. We get a sense of an event, but also some sort of meaning or potential thematic value within that event. So when you're reading a novel, for example, it's not just words that are randomly composed in some order that just tell a sequence of events. There are threads of meaning and themes and ideas that are woven throughout the novel in order to create something meaningful to propose to who it is that's reading it. So there's something that's greater than only the telling of a series of events. So in our inquiry work, we're writing both to the actual and the virtual, something in the moment, something tangible and lived, while also writing to the theoretical propositions that this moment might suggest. So it's not writing that comes after the experience that's added on. It's made in the liveness of things. It's not separate. So anecdotes possess what Van Manen calls a pragmatic thrust. They force us to consider the relation between the living and the thinking. And as Deleuze writes, where we're forced to think. So something in the lived experience provokes us to think, and that's how theory is in relation with doing. It's part of a lived experience. It's not separate. So the story sort of operates in this in-between pedagogical middle space between life and theory, between the individual and the context or the milieu. So we write our experience on paper, and in reading it, it speaks back to us. It's in a dialogic relation. It's a practical theorizing where stories make something visible, something that as teachers and researchers, we might reflect upon pedagogically. And this is particularly impactful when composing pedagogical narrations, as you read this week in the BC Early Learning Framework. So Van Manen goes further on to say that in writing, the writing of a story or of a narrative, there's a paradoxical nature as we're both writing of a particular event while also sort of speaking to the general or the universal. And I'm hesitant to use the word universal because I think that we can consider I think that we can consider how stories propose a movement between the particular and the shared, that nothing truly is wholly generalizable because there's multiplicity in that general. But we're writing of a specific moment that brings readers into some kind of shared experience, something familiar about the quality of the experience that renders it shared, where the underlying qualities of the story may speak to a glimpse of common meaning. Though this commonality is never whole and the same, there's always some aspect of difference in understanding. And that's something to think about in our writing, that we're writing to something specific, but we're also alluding to how others might be sharing this. Are there any questions at this point or any thoughts? Anybody wants to jump in? Okay, I'm going to move on. So writing in this way is a sort of a push and a pull between subjectivities and the world. It's a dance, a correspondence, as Sylvia might say, a movement in and out of discourse. So in writing something down, it moves beyond yourself. It becomes tangible, and then it's also open to dissensus and dialogue. It becomes something public, something in the world. It invites a response, and it calls on us to respond to it as well. And in some ways, there's kind of an ethical accountability here too in writing, because it's making something tangible, it's throwing something into the world, and that requires us to really think about what it is that we're deciding to throw. And as Van Manen writes, writing separates us from what we know, but it unites us more closely with what we know. It's that paradoxical dynamic, and that it distances us from the life world. It gives us some space to consider it, yet it also draws us more closely into the life world. It decontextualizes thought from practice for a moment, and then it brings it right back into practice. It abstracts our experiences of the world, yet it also concretizes our understanding of the world. It objectifies thought into print, yet it subjectifies our understanding of something that truly engages us. So it's that paradoxical back and forth. So pedagogical documentation or narrations, like phenomenological writing, are not a direct representation of what children say or do. It's not a representation of what happened. If we're seeking to understand truths as multiple and ever-changing as becoming, then pedagogical documentation and narrations are not truth-seeking. They're not truth-seeking activities. And this influences how we make connections of children's processes in curriculum making. We can't know the cause of why children are doing what they do or what they're feeling and thinking in particular moments, and that's not the purpose. But pedagogical narrations are the markings and makings of a living curriculum, the traces of a lived experience brought into the public space as a text. It's the texts for dialogue and responses to render something visible, and where something is brought into view, it's open to response and contestation, and that creates some kind of democratic process where knowledge is made in relation with others and it's up for dispute. So this week, I encourage you to make connections, take notes, and jot down some of your emerging ideas that layer across the BC Early Learning Framework, the Van Manen text, and then also the poetry links that I posted on eLearn by Erica Violet Lee and Billy Ray Belcourt. So think about how these texts might be read together in relation. They're very different, but they come to matter in particular ways in our roles as teacher researchers. So it's not enough. Oh, does someone have a question? No? Okay. So it's not enough to only stay in the poetic when we're thinking about poetry, and it's also not enough to only tell the literal what happened in inquiry work with children. As educators, we're drawing from multiple disciplines to compose rich texts that have pedagogical resonances and a deep situatedness within the actual work with children. But we're also writers who use the language to stretch ourselves beyond what we already are, and that's where poetics helps us to think beyond what already is. And so when we're thinking about our writing, it's about composing vocabularies. And I think that Jacques Derrida is actually really helpful when thinking about language and the power of language in this way. And I wanted to share with you 2 quotes from him this week because I find them really motivating as a writer. The first one, he says, "I would like to write you so simply, so simply, so simply, without having anything ever catch the eye, excepting yours alone, so that above all the language remains self-evidently secret, as if it were being invented at every step, and as if it were burning immediately." And then he also offers to us this phrase when he says, "Monsters cannot be announced. One cannot say, 'Here are monsters,' without immediately turning the monsters into pets." And the other day I was thinking about this in terms of horror movies and how like the power of a horror movie is the one that doesn't give it all away. It doesn't show you exactly what you're supposed to fear. It kind of dances around it, so that anticipation of what's fearful is what's powerful. That's the art of the horror movie, in my opinion. But that's just one example that you can think with in your writing, is to not come at something so directly as to totally give it away, but to create some kind of mystery, make us anticipate something, and in some ways leave some things out intentionally so that we have to fill it in. So in phenomenological writing, Van Manen writes explicitly that the choice of words matters. In cultivating a rich essence of a lived moment through text, we must be intentional in the words that we choose. So in your inquiry assignments, consider etymological expressions, sayings, idiomatic phrases, personifications, ways of telling something real, considering how you might play with words and language to call attention to something in a new way. And this is about the art of being sensitive, as Van Manen tells us. It's an artful sensitivity to the undertones of language, to the way language speaks when it allows the things themselves to speak. And in a few minutes, we'll be moving into small groups to generate some of these vocabularies together. And you'll have some time to think together in composing lists of phrases and metaphors, comparisons, similes, describing words, and sort of generating vocabularies around your chosen topic as a starting point. So I showed this slide last week, but I find that these are helpful in gathering sayings about your topic, like time flies, being in and out of time, running out of time, wasting time, spending time. Just some of these phrases that help you to think more about the concept. So in your writing, design matters, the form and function matters. Um, the arts teach us, the arts help us in this, in that it shows us that the form and the content must work together. This is very true in writing. So it's not only, as we've said before, about the photos being separate from the text. The photos and the text and the arrangement need to be purposefully composed as a piece, as something that works together. Um, think about yourselves as crafting your papers, as selecting words and composing your writing. It's very much like an artistic composition where the content of the work, what the meaning and the things that you're trying to say are enhanced through the use and the style of language and how that language comes together with your photos and design. So in this way, writing is a craft, it is composed, and it is made. And Van Manen writes, writing fixes thought onto paper. It externalizes what in some sense is eternal. It distances us from our own immediate lived involvements with the things in our world. As we stare at the paper, we stare at what we've written. Our objectified thinking now stares back at us. Thus, writing creates the reflective cognitive stance that generally characterizes the theoretical attitude in the social sciences. And this is something that I really enjoy about writing is that as you write something, it speaks back to you and your ideas about what it is that you're writing change through the process of writing. And this again is an example of how methods create our realities. Writing has a particular way of making sense of things in the process. So writing opens spaces for an embodied knowledge that can be brought to life or realized pedagogically. So then there's a power in writing that must be considered here. As we consider our vision and the question of power to see and from what position, from what lens, what we pay attention to and through what lens really matters. What stories we craft and what they do, there's always a pedagogical vision and an ethic at play. We are accountable here. So considering this, I think it's important to highlight that the stories that we wish to write may not necessarily have a formalized beginning, middle, or end. We can also think about how we might write stories that are able to transform, to mutate, to push us somewhere. And again, Van Manen writes that to write is to rewrite, to rethink, to reflect, re-recognize, and to research. So it's always in the process. So considering again the partiality and transformative nature of writing practices, there's always a sense of ambiguity so as to not explain something away into nothing, or to make the other into the same, to appropriate that what's different into what you already know. So in your inquiry assignments, I encourage you to consider the representational issues of trying to write the whole story. So how can you use story or narrative in a way that doesn't give it all away, that doesn't render something as a cliche, and that sort of attends to that danger of overwriting. In writing, try not to come directly at something, but walk around it. And this is where poetic writing is really impactful. It helps us to think beyond the cliche, beyond the direct explanation of something very literal, and to situate ourselves in the nuances, in those ephemeral spaces of thought where something can't be fully pinned down. There's something always that escapes us, and we're gesturing, provoking, and wondering about that which escapes. And George Eliot offers a beautiful example of this in Middlemarch in his writing when he says, if we had a key vision and feeling of all ordinary human life, it would be like hearing the grass grow and the squirrel's heartbeat. And we should die of that roar which lies on the other side of silence. I just love this quote and the way that the tone and metaphoric qualities of this phrase speak to that ephemerality of the other side of silence. It's a really provocative poetic phrase that's been taken up in many feminist circles. A feminist attunement and listening to what surely makes sounds, but perhaps goes unheard, that roar which lies on the other side of silence. And so, thinking about silence, if we listen, silence speaks something. Silence is not necessarily an empty space. There's something spoken in spaces where words fall, something of an ephemeral nature that alludes to something that exists perhaps on the edges of human knowledge, the edges of our perception. So think about what becomes possible when these spaces aren't quickly filled by words. What if we consider the languages and gestures of silence in our inquiries? So listening to silence and thinking through the Van Manen text. On page 112, he says that literal silence is where words pause. And in the absence of speaking, we are called to pay attention to something else. In writing silence, it also proposes an attention to something. Epistemological silence is where we encounter something beyond our linguistic capacities, where we're forced to think beyond our previously held knowledges of experience. And he writes that ontological silence, he writes of this as being in the presence of truth, where we come to encounter something and through silence we pause, gather a fulfilled insight with the world and meaning. So there's some kind of moment that you feel like you've gained some kind of understanding, however temporal that might be. So our intention is to reawaken the experience that we've lived, to relive it as it was felt, and to make it feel like the reader is there alongside you. In order to do this, and because living is so much more than words, we need to invent vocabularies beyond the literal, beyond the direct, vocabularies that live burning at the edges of the self and of the world, of pen and of paper. So really being intentional in the words that you select, and the phrases that you might choose to include. Sometimes a playfulness of language might help you in moving beyond the literal here. So this week on eLearn, I've shared 3 poetry links, a link to a poetry in voice collection. There are several poems on there to take a look at. There's also a link to a poem by Billy Ray Belcourt called Love is a Moontime Teaching. And there's a link to Erica Violet Lee's blog that has many of her poetry pieces on there. And so this week we'll be visiting these 3 pages and reading together poetry that uses imagery, imaginative language, to propose a particular message in an experimental way. So in your small groups, I'm gonna send you off into small breakup groups in just a minute. So in your small groups, you can choose 1 or 2 poems from one of the links to think with. So you can read them together and discuss the poem and consider, how do the authors play it with language? What are they asking us to pay attention to through their method? How do the words they use speak in conversation with their poetic style and the meaning of the poem? And try to notice the tonalities, pauses, intensities in the writing, the games, the tricks, the gestures of language that they're using here. And consider, how is this language intentional? Begin to consider, what is your style in writing? How might you use language in ways which reawakens, inspires, and provokes your attention to the lived experience or to your topic? And then once you've done that in your groups, you can take some time to think about the idiomatic phrases, sayings, metaphors, word games around your chosen topics. So use this these breakout rooms as a generative space to expand the language that you might use to think through your topic. As a teacher and researcher, phenomenological writing as method works in conversation with pedagogical narrations and a living curriculum. So we're making and writing curriculum into being. So the language and words that we use must be alive because we're working with a living curriculum. So do you have any questions at this point? There's a photo of the breakout room, this guide part 1 and part 2 that's posted on eLearn, as well as the links to the poetry websites. So when you go out into your breakout rooms, you can still access them from Moodle. Okay, so I'm just going to send you off into your breakout groups. Okay, and I'll give you about, let's see what time it is. I'll give you about 20 minutes to do that as a group. Okay, we'll see you in a few minutes, everybody.